The Arizona highlands had a way of turning fierce without warning. By late afternoon, the sun had already disappeared behind a wall of steel-gray clouds, and the temperature had plummeted. What had begun as a few flurries turned quickly into a biting storm, the kind that cut through clothing and rattled bone. Clara Weston hadn't expected it. She had set out that morning with the naive belief that the desert could never truly freeze, that its winters would be kinder than the sharp winds of Colorado she'd left behind. But she had underestimated the mountains, underestimated the sky's cruelty. By nightfall, she was little more than a shadow trudging along a half-buried road, her wool coat soaked through, boots stiff with ice. Her breath came ragged, pluming, in short bursts that vanished instantly into the whirling snow. Her horse had bolted hours ago, when the first crack of thunder rolled down the valley. Clara had tried to follow, calling out until her throat was raw, but the snow swallowed every sound. Since then, she had walked. Her legs burned from the effort, each step sinking ankle-deep into drifts. Her gloves were so wet they clung like icy bandages. She could no longer feel her fingertips, nor the tips of her ears beneath her scarf. Fear had crept in steadily, like the frost numbing her body. What if no one found her? What if she lay down and the snow simply covered her, erasing her as though she had never passed through this place? She was 24 years old, unmoored, running from a life that no longer fit her, but she hadn't imagined it would end here in the empty whiteness of a storm. Through half-frozen lashes she glimpsed a dark shape in the distance, almost lost in the snow's fury. At first she thought it was only another rock outcropping, jagged against the horizon. But as she staggered closer, she realized it was a structure, a barn, weather-beaten but standing strong, its roof pitched sharply to fight the weight of winter storms. Relief surged through her, almost painful in its suddenness. The sight gave her strength she didn't know she had. She pushed forward, stumbling, half crawling the last few yards. The barn loomed taller, its wooden planks groaning under the winds. Assault. A lantern flickered faintly at the far end, casting a trembling light. Someone was there. Someone had to be. She reached the wall and leaned her weight against the rough boards, chest heaving, snow clinging to her hair like crystals. Her knees buckled, and she nearly slid to the ground, but she pressed her palm against the wood, willing herself to stay upright. She could not collapse here, not when warmth was only steps away. The barn door creaked open before she could raise a fist to knock. A tall figure filled the threshold, shadowed against the glow inside. For a moment, Clara thought she had conjured him out of desperation, some vision to ease her last moments. But then he stepped forward, and she saw the solid weight of him. The dark braids tied neatly behind his shoulders, the broad chest covered by a heavy sheepskin coat. His eyes swept over her quickly, assessing, sharp as a hawk's, without a word. He reached out and caught her beneath the arms just as she sagged forward. The strength in his grip was startling. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing more than a bundle of reeds. Clara tried to speak, perhaps to explain, perhaps to plead, but her lips were too stiff. All that escaped was a weak breath, barely a sound. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and steady, like stone warmed by the sun. It was the first word she had heard in hours, and its calmness was enough to still her panic. She felt herself being carried, her cheek pressed against the coarse wool of his coat. The barn door closed behind them, muting the storm to a dull roar. She caught a glimpse of horses shifting in their stalls, the sweet smell of hay mixing with smoke. The warmth inside was relative, but still a miracle compared to the world outside. Her rescuer did not stop in the barn. Instead, he crossed to the cabin nearby, the glow of firelight spilling from its windows. He shouldered the door open with practiced ease and carried her inside. The sudden wash of heat from the hearth was overwhelming, stinging her numb skin. Back toward life, Clara's vision blurred. She managed one last glance upward at the man who had found her, noting the stern set of his jaw, the quiet intensity in his eyes. She wanted to ask his name, but darkness swept in before she could. And so, on that storm-swept night, in the arms of a stranger she did not yet know, Clara Weston's story at the ranch began. When Clara woke again, she was certain at first that she was still dreaming. A soft crackle filled her ears, steady and rhythmic, like distant applause. Then came the warmth and enveloping heat that seemed to seep into her bones, thawing places she had thought lost forever to the cold. Her eyes fluttered open to a dimly lit cabin. A fire blazed in a wide stone hearth, flames licking upward and casting shadows along walls built of thick pine logs. The room smelled of wood smoke, leather, and something faintly herbal. A hand-stitched quilt lay across her body, heavy and comforting, its pattern a patchwork of earth tones. Beneath it, she realized she wore nothing but her underclothes. Startled, she tried to sit up. The quilt slipped down, and the sudden exposure to air made her gasp. Pain shot through her arms as blood returned to her fingertips in cruel little stabs of fire. "Don't move too quick." The voice came from the corner, deep and measured. Clara turned her head, and there he was, the man from the barn. He sat in a straight-backed chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. His face was revealed fully now. High cheekbones, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, skin bronzed by the sun. His black hair, still damp from melted snow, was tied back into two braids that rested against his chest. She clutched the quilt tighter, her breath shallow. Where am I?" "My cabin," he replied simply. "You nearly froze outside." The words were blunt, but not unkind. He stood and moved closer, kneeling beside the cot where she lay. Up close, she saw the intensity in his dark eyes, not threatening, but searching, as though he were weighing her presence here, measuring her story before she could even tell. You stripped me," she said, her voice trembling between accusation and gratitude. "I saved you," he countered, his tone firm. "Wet clothes will kill faster than the cold. I only did what was needed." Shame and relief tangled inside her. She wanted to argue, but her body betrayed her, sinking back against the pillow with exhaustion. He was right had he not acted. She would be nothing more than another casualty of the Highlands winter. "What's your name?" she asked after a long silence. "Kai." The name settled between them, short and strong, like the man himself. "I'm Clara Weston," she offered, her voice softer now. He gave a small nod, acknowledging but not commenting further. His gaze drifted toward the fire as if considering his next words. "You'll be weak a while," he said at last. "Frostbite spares no one. I warmed your hands and feet, but you'll need time. Eat, rest. Then you'll be able to leave when the storm clears." Clara noticed how he spoke measured, economical, like a man who had learned to conserve words the way he might conserve water in a drought. There was no wasted flourish, no idle chatter. And yet, there was a steadiness that reassured her, a quiet certainty that made her believe she was safe. Her stomach growled then, loudly enough to make her cheeks flush. For the first time, Kai's lips curved almost imperceptibly a flicker of amusement. Without a word, he rose, crossed the room, and ladled something steaming from a black pot hung over the fire. When he returned, he set a bowl in her lap. The aroma of stew beef, potatoes, carrots, and wild herbs rose to meet her. Clara lifted the spoon with shaking hands, savoring the first bite as if it were the finest meal she had ever known. Kai sat back in his chair, watching her eat. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful reserve of a man unaccustomed to sharing his space with strangers. Between spoonfuls, Clara ventured, "You live out here alone?" He nodded once. "The ranch is mine. Horses, cattle, fences. It's enough. And no one else?" She pressed. "No one else," he he said simply. Shutting the door on that line of conversation as firmly as if he'd closed an actual door. Clara lowered her gaze, focusing on the stew. She recognized the barrier in his tone, something unspoken, perhaps painful, that lay behind his solitude. She did not push further. The firelight softened the hard edges of the cabin, turning the space into a cocoon against the storm's fury. Still howling outside. For the first time since she had set out days ago, Clara felt the weight of her fear lift slightly. The danger was not gone, but she was no longer facing it alone. When she finished the stew, Kai took the bowl and set it aside. Rest, he said, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders. His hands, though large and calloused, moved with surprising gentleness. Clara let her eyes close, exhaustion sweeping her under once more. The last thing she remembered was the sound of the storm beyond the cabin walls and the steady presence of the man who had rescued her, sitting silently in the chair nearby, watching over her as if she belonged there. The storm passed sometime during the night. When Clara woke again, the air inside the cabin was hushed, the fire reduced to a bed of glowing embers. Thin rays of sunlight peeked through the shutters, tracing faint golden lines across the wooden floorboards. For a long moment she lay still beneath the quilt, her body heavy with the kind of weariness that comes only after surviving something fierce. Her mind replayed fragments of the night before, the snow swallowing her steps, the dark figure in the barn, the warmth of being carried. She wondered if she had dreamed half of it, but the ache in her muscles and the scent of smoke on her skin told her it was all real. The chair beside her bed was empty now, though a folded blanket draped across the back suggested that Kai had spent the night nearby, keeping watch. She shifted slightly, wincing as pins and needles pricked her toes, life returning where numbness had threatened to take hold. The cabin was small but carefully kept. A table stood near the hearth, scarred with use but polished by time. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of dried herbs, bundles of leather tack, and tools arranged with quiet precision. It was not the home of a careless man. Everything here spoke of patience, discipline, and a life built with his own hands. Her stomach growled again, breaking the silence. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself and pushed to sit up. The effort was harder than she expected, her limbs trembling with weakness. Just then the door opened, letting in a draft of crisp morning air. Kai stepped inside, carrying an armful of firewood. Snow clung to the shoulders of his coat, glistening before melting into dark patches. He glanced at her, and for the first time she thought she saw something soften in his expression. Not quite a smile, but an acknowledgement that she was still here, still alive. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and even. "Yes," Clara managed, though her throat was rough. "I feel better, warmer." He nodded, setting the wood down by the hearth. With practiced movements, he coaxed the embers back into flame, adding kindling until fire once again crackled brightly. The warmth spread quickly through the cabin, chasing away the chill that had crept in overnight. Clara watched him, noticing how his hands moved, efficient, unhurried, as though everything he did was part of a rhythm older than words. She wanted to ask questions about him, about this place, but the quiet between them felt sacred somehow, and she feared breaking it too soon. Instead, she said softly, "Thank you for everything." Kai looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You would have died out there." The words were matter of fact, yet there was a weight behind them. He had seen it before. She realized people lost to the elements, claimed by storms they didn't respect. "I didn't think Arizona could be like this," Clara admitted. "Snow, wind, cold enough to steal the breath from you." A flicker of something amusement perhaps passed through his eyes. "The high country doesn't forgive mistakes. It teaches fast." She nodded, embarrassed by her own ignorance. "I should have known better." "You're alive," he said simply. "That's what matters." Kai moved to the table and retrieved a tin cup, filling it from a kettle that had been kept warm near the fire. He brought it to her, and the steam of hot tea rose to meet her face. She cradled the cup between her palms, savoring the heat that seeped into her skin. The tea was strong, slightly bitter, but it eased the rawness in her throat. They sat in companionable silence for a while, Clara sipping slowly while Kai busied himself with small tasks, checking his tools, sharpening a knife, mending a leather strap. It struck her that he was a man accustomed to silence, a man who did not need constant words to fill the space. Still, Clara found herself wanting to speak. "I was heading south," she said carefully, her eyes fixed on the tea. "Looking?" "For work, maybe a place to stay. My horse ran when the storm came. I thought I could make it on foot." Kai glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Why alone? The question pierced her more than she expected. She hesitated, then gave a small, sad laugh. "Because there wasn't anyone to come with me. And maybe because I didn't want anyone." 2. He didn't press further. Instead, he returned his focus to the leather strap, his hands working steadily. The lack of judgment in his silence made her chest tighten with unexpected relief. Outside, the wind had stilled. The snow on the roof slid in heavy sheets, thudding softly to the ground. The storm was over, but something new had begun within the walls of the cabin. Clara felt it like a spark, fragile but undeniable. The sense that she was not just recovering her strength here, but finding the first threads of connection. A warmth that went beyond fire and blankets died as she set down her empty cup, her gaze met Kai's. For a heartbeat, neither looked away. The silence stretched, no longer heavy but filled with possibility. Clara didn't yet know what path lay before her, but she knew one thing with certainty. The stranger who had saved her was no longer a stranger at all. By the second day, Clara was strong enough to rise from the bed. Her legs trembled when she stood, and Kai hovered just close enough to steady her without crowding. He offered no unnecessary words, only the steady presence of a man accustomed to letting actions speak. The cabin felt different from this vantage point. From the bed, it had seemed small, a cocoon against the storm. Standing now, Clara could see how deliberately it had been built. The beams were thick and sturdy, the table carved from a single slab of oak, the shelves lined with essentials, jars of beans, flour, dried corn, and bundles of herbs tied neatly with twine. Her eyes drifted to the table itself. It bore the marks of years' knife scratches, scorch rings from pots set down too hot, but it was polished smooth at the center, as though countless meals had been taken there. She imagined Kai sitting alone at its edge, night after night, eating in silence while the fire warmed only his side of the room. "Sit," Kai said, breaking into her thoughts. He pulled out a chair and gestured toward it. Clara obeyed, grateful for the chance to rest again. He moved about the small kitchen space with a quiet efficiency, slicing strips of dried venison, adding them to a pot of beans simmering over the fire, sprinkling in herbs she didn't recognize. "You cook?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. His mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. "I eat," he said simply, as if that explained everything. Clara laughed softly, the sound surprising even herself. It felt strange, after days of fear and exhaustion, to hear her own laughter again. Kai glanced at her, and for the briefest moment, the corner of his mouth lifted. It was a fleeting expression, but it warmed her more than the fire. When the meal was ready, he set a bowl before her. The aroma filled the cabin, rich and hearty. She murmured her thanks and picked up the spoon, savoring the first bite. The beans were flavored with wild sage, the venison tender despite its dryness. It was simple food, but nourishing, made more so by the effort behind it. Kai took his seat across from her. They ate mostly in silence, the clink of spoons against bowls punctuating the stillness. But Clara, unused to quiet company, felt the need to fill the space. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" she asked, her gaze flicking to his. He paused before answering, his spoon hovering. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the land keeps me busy. Horses don't wait. Fences don't fix themselves." Clara studied him, his broad shoulders bent slightly over the table, his hands steady and calloused. He spoke with the cadence of someone who had learned to make peace with solitude. Yet she wondered what it cost him, carrying silence as both shield and companion. And before this? She pressed gently, his eyes lifted, dark and unreadable. For a moment, she thought, he might shut her out completely. But then he said, "I served in the cavalry, rode far from here. When I came back, the land was all I wanted." There was more. She could tell layers of history tucked into the spaces between his words. But he did not offer them, and she did not pry. Instead, she nodded, respecting the boundaries he had set. She hesitated, then shared her own truth. "I left Denver 2 weeks ago. My father died last year. My mother wanted me married off quick to a banker's son. Said it was security, a good match. But," she set her spoon down, her voice tightening, "it felt like a cage, so I ran." Kai's gaze stayed on her, steady but not condemning. "You chose your own road," he said simply. Clara exhaled, as though those words alone lifted a weight. From her chest, she had expected judgment, or worse, pity. But his acceptance, unadorned and matter-of-fact, gave her a strange comfort. They finished their meal quietly. When she rose to help clear the table, Kai stopped her with a hand raised. "Rest," he said firmly. "You're not strong yet." She sat back down, feeling oddly cared for, though she was unaccustomed to such consideration. She watched him move about the cabin, tidying, stacking wood near the hearth, checking the latch on the door. Each task was deliberate, a rhythm of survival etched into daily life. Later, as the fire burned low, Clara looked at the table again. It no longer seemed like the solitary fixture she had first imagined. Tonight, it had held two people, two stories, beginning to weave together. For the first time in months, Clara felt less like a fugitive and more like someone who might belong. Somewhere not in Denver's parlors, not in the cold emptiness of the storm, but here, at this rough-hewn table in a cabin on the Highland Ranch. And across from her, Kai sat quietly, as if he too recognized that something had shifted. Neither spoke it aloud, but the air between them was no longer just silence. It was the beginning of companionship. By the third day, Clara was no longer content to sit idle. Her strength had returned enough that she could walk the length of the cabin without trembling, and though Kai urged her to rest, she insisted on doing more. "I can't just sit and watch you work," she told him, standing with her arms crossed, determination flashing in her eyes. Kai studied her silently for a long moment, as if weighing whether to argue. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine, but you'll start with something light." The first task he set her was feeding the horses. The barn, warm with the musk of hay and the gentle sounds of the animals shifting in their stalls, welcomed her like a cathedral of wood and straw. Kai showed her where the feed was kept, his large hands scooping grain into buckets. Clara followed his lead, stumbling a little under the weight, though she refused to let it show. "You're stubborn," he remarked when she nearly tripped over a loose board but caught herself before spilling a single kernel. Clara shot him a grin. "You sound surprised." He didn't answer, but there was the faintest curve at the edge of his mouth. The horses accepted her presence with patient eyes and soft knickers. Clara stroked their warm muzzles, marveling at the strength and gentleness in them. Kai watched from a distance, arms folded, as if gauging how she fit into the rhythm of ranch life. The days fell into a steady pattern. Clara joined Kai in small chores, mending a section of fence that the storm had battered, carrying buckets of water from the well, gathering kindling from the woods nearby. Each task left her tired but satisfied, her body remembering what it meant to work with purpose. Sometimes they worked side by side in silence, the quiet between them no longer awkward but companionable. Other times, conversation wove its way into the rhythm of their labor. Clara learned that Kai had been raised on this very land, his people tied to it long before the fences and cattle. She learned that he had once ridden far beyond Arizona, seen battlefields and barracks, but had returned because no place else had ever felt like home. In turn, she shared fragments of her own story growing up in Denver, the strict expectations of her family, the weight of a future planned for her, without consent. When she confessed how unprepared she had been for the storm, Kai's expression softened just slightly. "The land tests everyone," he told her. "Even me. You don't fail by falling. You fail by staying down." One afternoon, as they repaired a broken rail on the fence line, Clara's laughter broke loose when the hammer she wielded slipped from her grip and tumbled into the snow. Kai retrieved it for her, shaking his head, but she caught the briefest flicker of amusement in his eyes. It was the first time she'd heard her own laughter ring so freely since before her father's death, and the sound seemed to change something between them. Later, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the snow in gold and rose, Clara found herself standing beside him, their shoulders nearly brushing. Neither spoke, but she felt a warmth radiating that had nothing to do with the fire waiting back in the cabin. That evening, at the rough-hewn table, the air carried a lighter weight. Clara sliced bread while Kai poured coffee, their movements almost synchronized, as though they had done this many times before. She caught herself imagining what it might be like to share this table every night, not as a guest, but as something more. The thought startled her, yet it lingered, impossible to dismiss. When Kai looked up and met her gaze across the lamplight, she didn't look away. There was no need for words. Something unspoken pulsed in the space between them, something fragile, but real. It was not yet love, not yet the certainty of two lives entwined. But it was the beginning, a trust built on small kindnesses, on shared work, on silence that no longer felt empty. And as Clara lay in bed that night, the quilt pulled snug around her, she realized that she no longer felt like a stranger here. She was beginning to belong not only to the cabin and the land, but to the man who had carried her out of the storm. Winter's storms came and went in fits, each one a reminder of how quickly the land could turn cruel. By the end of Clara's first week at the ranch, another front rolled in, wind lashing the windows, snow piling in thick drifts against the barn doors. This time, she wasn't alone in the cold. She was safe inside Kai's cabin, the hearth glowing bright, the air filled with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. She had grown used to the rhythm of life here, rising early, sharing chores, working side by side with Kai in quiet companionship. But that night, as the storm raged, the silence between them shifted. It was no longer only comfortable. It was charged. Clara sat at the table, darning a rip in one of her gloves by lamplight. Kai stood at the window, his broad shoulders tense as he watched the snow whip sideways across the land. The firelight painted him in amber and shadow, his profile sharp, solemn. "You watch the storm like it's an enemy," she said gently. He turned his head slightly. "It is. You don't turn your back on something that can kill." Clara lowered her eyes to her stitching, thoughtful. "But you also respect it." His silence was agreement. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. Clara pricked her finger on the needle, hissing softly. A bead of blood welled up. She pressed it to her lips, embarrassed. In 2 strides, Kai was beside her, crouching low. He took her hand in his his touch careful, deliberate. His thumb brushed against her palm as he checked the small wound, and though it was nothing more than a pinprick, Clara's heart thudded as if he had touched something far deeper. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling more than she intended. His gaze lifted to hers. The fire flickered in his dark eyes, reflecting something unspoken, something he had held back for days. For a long moment, neither moved. The storm roared around them, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Clara felt the air tighten, pulling them together like invisible threads. She had been careful not to imagine this, had told herself she was only a guest here, only passing through. Yet in that silence, with Kai's hand wrapped around hers, she knew they were standing on the edge of something that could no longer be ignored. Kai released her hand slowly, almost reluctantly, and stood. He turned toward the fire, bracing one arm against the mantel as though to steady himself. Clara rose too, the quilt slipping from her shoulders, her bare feet soundless on the wooden floor. "Why do you keep your distance?" she asked quietly. Her words trembled, but her eyes did not waver. Kai's jaw tightened. "Because I've lost before." Clara's chest ached at the weight in his voice. She stepped closer. "And if you never try again, you'll lose anyway." The storm battered the cabin walls, but the only force that mattered was the one drawing them together. Clara reached for him, her fingers grazing his sleeve. He turned, and the restraint in his eyes cracked like ice, giving way to the river beneath when he kissed her. It was not hesitant. It was fierce, born of days of silence and longing. Clara melted into him, her hands fisting in the wool of his shirt, his arms encircling her as though he meant to keep her safe from every storm, past and future. He led her to the bed, the same cot where she had nearly frozen days before. But this time there was no fear, no desperation, only heat, only the steady rhythm of two hearts finding each other. Outside the wind howled, the snow fell heavy, but inside they built a fire of their own. Later, as the storm eased, Clara lay against his chest, listening to the strong, steady beat beneath her ear. Kai's arm rested around her, protective yet tender, his breath slow with sleep. She closed her eyes, realizing that she had crossed a threshold she could never return from. This was no longer just shelter, no longer just rescue. This was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, a love born in the heart of winter, fragile yet fierce, like the fire that refused to die even when the wind raged against the walls. When the storm broke the next morning, the world lay hushed beneath a blanket of white so deep it seemed to swallow the land whole. Sunlight glittered off the drifts, blinding and pure, as if nothing had ever existed before that day. Inside the cabin, however, the air was heavy with the awareness of what had changed. Clara woke curled against Kai, the quilt tangled around their bodies. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to simply feel it, the warmth of his skin, the solid strength of his arm draped across her waist, the steady rhythm of his breath. But reality crept in quickly, unrelenting. What happened now? Her life before had been a chain of expectations and rules, and she had broken free of them with desperate determination. Yet freedom had always meant movement, running, never staying long enough for roots to take hold. Now, for the first time, she wondered if she wanted to stop. If she dared. Kai stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He studied her in silence, his gaze steady, unreadable. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but certain. "You don't belong to this place." Clara's chest tightened. "And what if—" "I want to?" He shook his head, pulling himself upright. "You're not built for the life here. It's hard, lonely. The land takes more than it gives. You'll regret it." She sat up, clutching the quilt around her. "Don't tell me what I'll regret." Her voice trembled with anger she hadn't meant to show. "I've had people do that all my life. My mother, society, everyone telling me what I should want, who I should marry, what future I should choose. I won't let you do the same." The silence between them was sharp as a blade. Kai stood, pulling on his shirt, his movements controlled, but tight with tension. "I'm not them," he said at last. "But I've lived this life. I know what it costs. And I won't watch you suffer because of me." His words struck her harder than she expected, because beneath them lay truth. He was afraid not for himself, but of losing her, of opening his heart only to have her walk away when the world called her back. Clara rose too, anger giving way to something more vulnerable. "You don't get to decide that for me, Kai. Maybe I'm not as fragile as you think. Maybe I've been running so long that what I want now is to stop, to stay." His eyes met hers then, dark and conflicted. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might relent, might admit that he wanted the same. But instead, he turned away, busying himself with the fire, feeding logs into the flames as though the crackle of burning wood could drown out the storm inside him. The day passed with distance between them. They worked side by side in silence, their hands busy but their thoughts miles apart. Clara carried water, fed the horses, mended what she could. Kai repaired the outer fence where the storm had torn it down, his back bent against the wind. Their bodies moved in rhythm, but the ease of companionship from before had fractured. That night, at the table, the food tasted like ash. Clara forced herself to eat, though her throat was tight. Kai barely touched his bowl. The lamplight cast long shadows between them, and for the first time since she had arrived, the silence was not comforting but unbearable. Finally, Clara set down her spoon. "Tell me the truth," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Is it me you don't trust or yourself?" Kai's hand stilled on the table. Slowly, he lifted his gaze to hers. For once, the walls he kept so carefully in place seemed to crack. She saw it then, the raw wound of loss, the weight of years spent alone, the fear of opening himself only to lose again. He didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. Clara rose, the quilt slipping from her shoulders, her hands clenched at her sides. "I can't promise forever. No one can, but I'm here now. And I won't run unless you push me away." She left him sitting there, his face carved in shadow, torn between the walls he'd built and the fragile hope that had begun to grow. Between them, that night, as Clara lay alone in the bed where only hours before they had shared warmth and closeness, she realized that love was not the easy shelter she had imagined. It was a storm of its own, fierce and testing. And whether it would break them or bind them together remained uncertain. The next morning dawned clear, the sky a sharp blue that stretched endlessly over the snow-covered valley. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind felt heavier. Then the drifts piled against the barn. Clara rose early, her breath visible in the chill before Kai stirred the fire to life. She dressed quickly, wrapped herself in the quilt, and stepped outside. The air bit at her skin, but it was clean, bracing a reminder that she was alive. The mountains loomed white and vast, the land glistening as if it had been remade overnight. She walked toward the barn, her boots crunching through the crust of snow. The horses nickered when they saw her, their warm breath fogging the air. She stroked their muzzles, speaking softly, more to herself than to them. "You almost lost me," she whispered, not sure if she meant the storm, her old life, or Kai. When she turned back, she found him standing at the doorway, watching her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a weight she could no longer ignore. "You plan to keep moving," he said flatly, as though bracing for the answer. Clara met his gaze steadily. "That's what you think of me?" "That I'll just run." "Again?" Kai stepped forward, the snow crunching under his boots. "I've seen people leave. My mother, my brother, friends from the regiment. All gone. The land keeps me, but it doesn't keep anyone else." His voice cracked low and rough. "Why should you be different?" Her chest tightened, but she didn't look away. "Because I want to be. Because for the first time in my life, I don't feel trapped. I feel free. And it's not the land that makes me feel that way, Kai. It's you." His jaw flexed as though the word struck a place he'd long tried to keep hidden. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he let out a breath that hung in the cold air like smoke. "I don't know how to be what you need," he admitted. "I can mend fences, break a horse, fight a storm. But this," he gestured between them, his voice rough, "this scares me." Clara took a step closer, her eyes never leaving his. "Then let it scare us together. I don't need promises of forever, Kai. I just need honesty. I need a chance to build something not alone this time." The silence stretched. The horses shifted in their stalls. The wind whispered through the pines. And then, finally, Kai reached for her hand. His palm was rough, his grip strong, but the way he held her was careful, almost reverent. "You'd stay here," he said, not as a question but as a realization. "Yes," Clara answered. "Not because I'm stuck, because I choose it." "One choose." "You." Something in his shoulders eased, as though a weight he'd carried for years had finally lifted. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, and though his face remained composed, his eyes told her everything. The walls were down. The days that followed were not perfect. The work was hard, the land demanding. Clara stumbled often, her hands blistered from tools, her body sore from labor. Yet each night, when they sat together at the scarred wooden table, sharing a meal, or when she leaned against Kai as the fire burned low, she felt a sense of belonging she had never known. Together they mended fences, drove cattle through the snow-packed trails, split wood for the fires yet to come. Together they found a rhythm, his strength balancing her stubbornness, her laughter softening his reserve. And slowly the cabin changed too. The table no longer bore only the weight of one man's solitude. It carried the warmth of shared bread, the murmur of conversation, the spark of new beginnings. On a quiet evening weeks later, Clara stood outside watching the sun dip behind the mountains. Kai came to stand beside her, his arm brushing hers. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. The silence between them had become something sacred, no longer emptiness, but fullness. She thought of the night she had nearly frozen by the barn, how close she had come to vanishing into the storm. And she thought of this moment, alive and warm beside the man who had carried her to safety, who had become more than a rescuer, not a cage, not a storm, a choice. A home. And with that, a love story began, not sudden or easy, but steady, like the land itself. Fierce enough to weather every winter, tender enough to grow with every spring.